What began as an ordinary evening shift at a children's hospital turned into something no one could have predicted. 78 leather-clad bikers rolled into the parking lot with a mission that would challenge everything the staff thought they knew about these intimidating strangers. This is a story about prejudice, courage, and an unlikely alliance that saved a little girl's life. By the end, you'll question every assumption you've ever made about the people you pass on the street. Stay with us and let us know in the comments. Have you ever been completely wrong about someone? The fluorescent lights of Memorial Children's Hospital hummed their familiar tune on that Friday evening in late September. Located in the heart of Portland, Oregon, the 6-story building stood as a beacon of hope for countless families navigating the darkest chapters of their lives. The autumn air carried the scent of rain, typical for the Pacific Northwest, as the city prepared to settle into another weekend. Inside room 314, 7-year-old Sarah Martinez lay in her hospital bed, her once vibrant brown hair now reduced to thin patches from aggressive chemotherapy treatments. She clutched a worn, stuffed rabbit, a gift from her grandmother who had passed away the previous year. The rabbit's fur was matted from countless nights of tears and whispered prayers, but to Sarah it represented the only constant in a life that had become unrecognizable. Her mother, Rebecca Martinez, sat in the uncomfortable vinyl chair that had become her second home. At 32 years old, Rebecca looked a decade older. Dark circles carved deep shadows under her eyes, and her clothes hung loosely on a frame that had shed 20 pounds in the 3 months since Sarah's leukemia diagnosis. She worked the night shift as a waitress at a downtown diner, but she hadn't been to work in weeks. The bills were piling up, the rent was 2 months overdue, and none of it mattered as much as the small, fragile girl fighting for her life in that bed. Rebecca's phone buzzed for the 14th time that evening. She didn't need to look to know who it was. David Martinez, her ex-husband and Sarah's father, had been relentless since the restraining order was filed 6 weeks ago. The texts ranged from apologetic to threatening, sometimes within the same minute. The last one she had read, against her better judgment, sent ice through her veins. "You can't keep me from my daughter forever. I'm coming for her." Down the hallway, nurse Jennifer Chen made her rounds with practiced efficiency. At 47, she had worked at Memorial for nearly 2 decades, and she prided herself on reading situations before they escalated. Something felt different tonight. She couldn't put her finger on it, but the air seemed charged with anticipation, like the moments before a summer thunderstorm breaks over the mountains. At the security desk in the main lobby, Officer Marcus Thompson scrolled through his phone, stealing glances at the football game highlights. Security at a children's hospital was typically uneventful. The occasional confused visitor, a parent who needed directions, nothing that required the combat training from his former military career. Marcus had taken this job specifically because it was predictable, a welcome change after 2 tours in Afghanistan where every moment held potential violence. But predictability was about to shatter. Across town, in a gravel parking lot behind Joe's Tavern, the Iron Brotherhood Motorcycle Club was gathering for their weekly Friday night ride. The tavern sat in a working-class neighborhood where chain-link fences bordered small houses with covered porches, where people knew their neighbors and watched out for each other's kids. This wasn't the glamorous side of Portland that tourists photographed, but it was real, and it was home. Jake Morrison, known universally as Hammer, straddled his 2015 Harley-Davidson Street Glide and surveyed his brothers. At 58 years old, Hammer carried himself with the quiet authority of a man who had seen the worst of humanity and chosen to fight it anyway. His weathered face told stories of bar fights and broken noses, but his eyes held something softer, something that spoke of second chances and hard-earned wisdom. The Iron Brotherhood patch on his leather vest wasn't just decoration, it was a promise. Beside him, Tommy Wrench Patterson was adjusting his bike's mirrors for the 3rd time. Wrench was the club's mechanic, a man who could resurrect a dead engine but struggled with words. His massive hands, scarred and oil-stained, moved with surprising gentleness. At 43, he was one of the younger members, but his loyalty had earned him a place in the inner circle. Maria Blade Rodriguez stood with her arms crossed, her long black hair pulled back in a tight braid. As one of only 7 women in the 78-member club, she had nothing to prove, but she carried herself like someone ready to prove it anyway. A former EMT who had seen too many preventable tragedies, Blade had been instrumental in steering the the club toward their current mission. Tonight's ride wasn't just about freedom and brotherhood. 3 months ago, the Iron Brotherhood had officially joined the National Network of Bikers Against Child Abuse, an organization that used the intimidating presence of motorcycle clubs to protect children from their abusers. They had completed their training, undergone background checks, and received their first assignment just 48 hours earlier. Hammer pulled a folded piece of paper from his vest pocket. On it was a photograph of Sarah Martinez, smiling in what was clearly a school picture taken before her diagnosis. Attached was a summary from Lisa Chen, a social worker who volunteered with Baka and happened to be Nurse Jennifer Chen's younger sister. The summary detailed Sarah's situation: aggressive leukemia treatment, a violent father with a restraining order who kept threatening to take her from the hospital, and a mother at her breaking point. The father, David Martinez, had a record: assault, domestic violence, drunk and disorderly conduct. He had served 2 years in prison for nearly killing a man in a bar fight, and according to the restraining order documents, he had broken Rebecca's arm during their last argument. Now, separated and bitter, he blamed Rebecca for everything, including Sarah's illness. His logic, twisted by alcohol and rage, convinced him that if he could just take Sarah away from the hospital, away from Rebecca, she would get better. Lisa Chen's notes included the most chilling detail. David had been spotted in the hospital parking lot 3 times in the past week, circling in his truck, watching the entrance. Each time, security had escorted him off the property, but they couldn't be everywhere at once. The restraining order was just paper, and David Martinez didn't strike anyone as the type to respect paper. Hammer folded the document carefully and returned it to his pocket. He raised his voice over the rumble of idling engines. The speech was brief, as all of Hammer's speeches were. He didn't believe in wasting words when actions spoke louder. The plan was simple. They would ride to Memorial Children's Hospital in a show of force that left no room for misinterpretation. They would introduce themselves to Rebecca and Sarah, explain their purpose, and establish a protection schedule. Members of the Iron Brotherhood would maintain a presence at the hospital around the clock, in shifts, until David Martinez was no longer a threat. They would be intimidating without being aggressive, present without being intrusive, and above all, they would keep Sarah safe. As 78 motorcycles roared to life, the sound echoed off the brick buildings and shook the windows of the tavern. Neighbors stepped onto their porches, familiar with the Friday night ritual. Children waved, and the bikers waved back. This was their community, and protecting the vulnerable was what they did. They pulled out of the parking lot in tight formation, a river of chrome and leather flowing through the darkening streets of Portland. The sun had set behind the West Hills, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. Streetlights flickered on, and the city transitioned into its night rhythm. At Memorial Children's Hospital, Officer Marcus Thompson stood from his desk, stretching his back and considering another cup of the terrible break-room coffee. Through the glass doors of the main entrance, he noticed something unusual. In the distance, growing louder by the second, was a sound he recognized from his younger days. Motorcycles, lots of them. His hand moved instinctively to the radio on his belt. The sound grew from a distant rumble to a thunderous roar. Marcus stepped outside, and his jaw dropped. 78 motorcycles were turning into the hospital parking lot, their headlights cutting through the twilight like searchlights. Inside the hospital, Nurse Jennifer Chen heard the commotion and rushed to the nearest window. Her heart began to race. In her 20 years at Memorial, nothing like this had ever happened. She grabbed the phone and called for backup security, her voice urgent but controlled. Parents in the waiting rooms stood and moved toward their children. Visitors in the hallways paused, uncertain. The sound was impossible to ignore, a visceral vibration that seemed to shake the very foundation of the building. In room 314, Sarah stirred from her nap. Rebecca jumped from her chair, instantly alert. The roar of engines had penetrated even the thick hospital walls. Rebecca's first thought was David. Somehow, impossibly, he had found a way to make good on his threats. Her hands trembled as she moved to the door, positioning herself between Sarah and whatever was coming. The bikers parked their motorcycles in organized rows, the sound gradually diminishing as engines were cut one by one. The silence that followed felt almost oppressive after such overwhelming noise. 78 men and women dismounted, their leather vests bearing the Iron Brotherhood patch clearly visible in the parking lot lights. Hammer walked at the front, his boots hitting the pavement with purpose. Behind him, His brothers and sisters followed in loose formation. They weren't trying to look threatening, but 78 bikers moving together created an intimidating spectacle regardless of intention. Officer Marcus Thompson positioned himself at the entrance, his hand near his weapon but not on it. His military training kicked in, assessing threats and exits. He keyed his radio, requesting immediate backup from Portland police. This was beyond his pay grade. Hammer approached the security desk with his hands visible, palms open. He understood how this looked. He had been on the other side of assumptions his entire adult life. People saw the leather, the tattoos, the weathered face, and they wrote a story that had nothing to do with reality. The automatic doors slid open, and the Iron Brotherhood entered Memorial Children's Hospital. The lobby fell silent. Parents clutched their children. Staff members froze mid-step. Even the volunteers at the information desk stopped what they were doing to stare. Hammer stopped 3 feet from Officer Thompson, maintaining a respectful distance. What he said next would determine everything. His voice was calm, steady, and carried the weight of absolute sincerity. And in that moment, as fear and confusion hung thick in the air, the story that would change everything was about to begin. The fluorescent lights of Memorial Children's Hospital seemed harsher now, casting sharp shadows across the faces of 78 bikers standing in the lobby. Officer Marcus Thompson's hand remained near his weapon, his military instincts screaming that he was outnumbered and outgunned, even though no one had made a threatening move. Hammer kept his hands visible, his posture non-threatening but confident. He had been in situations like this countless times, the moment when people had to choose between their prejudices and the truth. He had learned that the best weapon against fear was honesty, delivered with patience and respect. Behind Hammer, the Iron Brotherhood stood in disciplined silence. No one fidgeted, no one made sudden movements. They understood that they were fighting a battle of perception, and perception could be more dangerous than any physical confrontation. Nurse Jennifer Chen appeared from the hallway, her phone already pressed to her ear, speaking urgently to hospital administration. 2 more security guards emerged from a side corridor, their faces tense. The receptionist at the main desk had ducked below the counter, and several visitors had quietly moved toward the exits. Hammer pulled a laminated card from his vest pocket, moving slowly and deliberately. It was his identification from Bikers Against Child Abuse, complete with his photograph, real name, and a phone number for verification. He slid it across the desk to Officer Thompson. Officer Thompson picked up the card, his eyes scanning it quickly before locking back onto Hammer. The tension in his shoulders eased slightly, but he remained alert. He had heard of Barker before, during a community policing seminar years ago. The concept had seemed almost absurd at the time, motorcycle clubs protecting abused children, but the card was legitimate, and something in Hammer's eyes suggested truth rather than deception. The hospital administrator, Dr. Patricia Walsh, arrived with remarkable speed, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. At 55, she had managed Memorial for 8 years, navigating crises ranging from funding shortages to infectious disease outbreaks. But 78 bikers in her lobby was unprecedented. Her face was a mask of professional composure, but her hands betrayed her anxiety, clutching a tablet like a shield. Hammer turned to face Dr. Walsh, and his expression softened. He recognized the weight of responsibility in her eyes. She was thinking about the children upstairs, the liability, the potential for disaster. He needed to reach her quickly before fear calcified into inflexible opposition. Dr. Walsh listened, her expression shifting from defensive to skeptical to something approaching understanding. She looked past Hammer at the assembled bikers, seeing details she had missed in her initial assessment. These weren't the criminal stereotypes she had imagined. Many were middle-aged or older. Several had grey hair. One man near the back was clearly in his 70s, and scattered throughout the group were women, their presence somehow making the whole scene less threatening. Officer Thompson made a call on his radio, requesting that the Portland police backup stand down but remain available. He wasn't entirely convinced, but he was willing to let this play out. His instincts, honed through years of reading people in life or death situations, told him that Hammer was telling the truth. Nurse Jennifer Chen lowered her phone, having heard enough of the conversation to understand what was happening. A memory surfaced. Her younger sister Lisa, the social worker, had mentioned something about connecting a family with a biker organization. Jennifer had dismissed it as one of Lisa's idealistic projects, never imagining it would manifest as 78 78 motorcycles crashing into her hospital. Dr. Walsh made a decision. She asked Hammer to wait in the lobby with most of his group while she, Officer Thompson and Hammer, went upstairs to room 314 to speak with Rebecca Martinez. She needed to confirm that this protection was wanted before allowing this unprecedented situation to continue. Hammer agreed immediately. He turned to his brothers and sisters, his voice carrying authority but no threat. The Iron Brotherhood would wait. They had learned patience through years of advocacy work. Rushing would only create more problems. As Hammer, Dr. Walsh and Officer Thompson headed toward the elevators, the lobby remained frozen in an awkward tableau. Parents who had been edging toward exits now stopped, uncertain. The bikers stood in loose groups, some making quiet conversation, others simply waiting with the stillness of people accustomed to long rides and longer vigils. Maria Blade Rodriguez stepped forward slightly, her nursing background giving her an instinct for de-escalation. She smiled at a young mother clutching a toddler near the entrance, her voice gentle. The mother hesitated, then nodded slowly. The toddler, a boy of perhaps 3 years old with wide, curious eyes, pointed at Blade's leather vest and giggled. Blade crouched down to his level, making herself less imposing, and pulled a small stuffed teddy bear from one of her vest pockets. She always carried them for moments like this. The gesture rippled through the lobby. Other children began to peek out from behind their parents. One of the bikers, an older man named Ray Pops Henderson, pulled out a deck of cards and started performing simple magic tricks for a group of teenagers in the waiting area. The tricks were corny, disappearing quarters, card predictions, but they broke the tension like a hammer through ice. Upstairs, the elevator doors opened on the 3rd floor. The pediatric ward was quieter than the lobby, but nurses at their stations looked up with alarm as the unlikely trio approached. Word had spread quickly through the hospital's communication network. Bikers in the building. Dr. Walsh led the way to room 314, her stride purposeful, but her mind racing through potential complications. What if Rebecca Martinez didn't want this protection? What if this made things worse? What if David Martinez saw this as a challenge and escalated his threats? She knocked softly on the door, the sound barely audible over the ambient noise of medical equipment and distant conversations. Rebecca opened the door a crack, her face pale and streaked with tears. She had heard the motorcycles, heard the commotion, and spent the last 15 minutes convinced that David had somehow orchestrated an attack. Her relief at seeing Dr. Walsh was visible, but confusion quickly followed when she noticed the large man in leather standing behind the administrator. Dr. Walsh introduced Hammer, explaining briefly but clearly why he was there. Rebecca's expression cycled through disbelief, suspicion, and finally a desperate hope that someone, anyone, could actually keep her daughter safe. Hammer spoke directly to Rebecca, his voice losing all traces of the authority he had used in the lobby. This was a conversation between one parent and another. He had 3 grown children of his own, and he knew the terror of feeling powerless to protect them. Rebecca's legs seemed to lose strength, and she sat heavily in the chair beside Sarah's bed. Sarah stirred, her eyes opening slowly. The medication kept her in a constant state of drowsiness, but she was aware enough to sense her mother's distress. Sarah's voice was small, barely above a whisper, but it carried the kind of perception that children often possess. She looked at Hammer without fear, seeing past the intimidating exterior to something else. Hammer's weathered face softened completely. He knelt beside Sarah's bed, making himself less imposing, and his voice took on a gentleness that contradicted everything about his appearance. Sarah considered this, her small hand still clutching her worn rabbit. Then she smiled, a small but genuine expression that transformed her pale, gaunt face into something beautiful. Rebecca began to cry, but this time her tears were different. They weren't tears of exhaustion or fear or despair. They were tears of relief, the kind that come when a burden you've been carrying alone is suddenly shared. She reached out and took Hammer's scarred, weathered hand in both of hers. Officer Thompson, standing in the doorway, felt something shift in his chest. He had been prepared for this to be a security nightmare. Instead, he was witnessing something he couldn't quite name, but recognized as important. Dr. Walsh excused herself to make arrangements. If the Iron Brotherhood was going to maintain a presence at Memorial Children's Hospital, there would be protocols to establish, schedules to coordinate, and a great deal of explaining to do to the board of directors. But watching Hammer interact with Sarah and Rebecca, she felt certain this was the right decision. As they prepared to leave the room, Hammer turned back to Sarah one more time. room. Sarah giggled despite her exhaustion, the sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. Rebecca covered her mouth, a genuine laugh escaping through her tears. It was the first time she had laughed in months. Back in the lobby, Wrench was explaining the finer points of motorcycle maintenance to a group of fascinated teenagers. Pops had gathered a small crowd for his magic show. Blade was showing a young girl how to braid hair like hers. The Iron Brotherhood had transformed from an intimidating presence into something unexpectedly ordinary. When Hammer returned and explained that Rebecca had accepted their protection, a quiet cheer went through the group. This was why they did this work. This moment, when fear transformed into hope, was worth every prejudiced glance and every assumption they had to overcome. Dr. Walsh worked quickly to establish protocols. The bikers would maintain their presence in shifts, no more than 4 at a time in the hospital corridors. They would coordinate with security. They would respect hospital rules and patient privacy. They would be visible but not disruptive. Officer Thompson, now fully on board, volunteered to help establish the schedule and communication protocols. His military background made him ideal for organizing the rotations, and his endorsement lent legitimacy to the arrangement. As the first shift of 4 bikers, including Hammer, Blade, Wrench, and a quiet man named Silent Jim, positioned themselves in the hallway outside Sarah's room, the rest of the Iron Brotherhood prepared to leave. They would return in 4-hour shifts around the clock until David Martinez was no longer a threat. Parents who had initially fled toward the exits now approached the bikers with questions. Who were they? Why were they doing this? Could they help other families? The conversation that began with fear was evolving into curiosity, and curiosity was the first step toward understanding. Nurse Jennifer Chen watched from her station, her initial alarm replaced by something approaching admiration. She called her sister Lisa to confirm the details, and Lisa's excitement crackled through the phone. This was exactly what Barker was supposed to do, challenge assumptions while protecting the vulnerable. In room 314, Sarah had fallen back asleep, but there was something different about her posture. The tension that had kept her curled into herself was gone. She lay relaxed, her breathing steady, her small hand still clutching her rabbit, but not with the desperate grip of before. Rebecca sat beside her daughter's bed, watching the 4 bikers through the room's window. They stood with relaxed alertness, talking quietly among themselves, occasionally nodding to passing nurses who were beginning to accept their presence. For the first time in months, Rebecca felt like she could breathe. The night stretched ahead, full of uncertainty and potential. David Martinez was still out there, still a threat. Sarah's battle with leukemia was far from over. The bills were still piling up, the rent was still overdue, and tomorrow would bring its own challenges. But tonight, Rebecca wasn't alone. Tonight, 78 strangers had ridden into her life on motorcycles, shattering her expectations and offering something she had almost forgotten existed: hope. As the remaining bikers rolled out of the parking lot, their engines creating a symphony of departure, Officer Marcus Thompson stood at the entrance and watched them go. He thought about his own assumptions, the stories he had written in his head before hearing the truth. He thought about his military service, about the brothers he had served with who came from backgrounds he had never understood until he had fought beside them. Inside the hospital, the night shift settled into its rhythm, but nothing was quite the same as it had been before. The nurses whispered about the bikers in the hallway. The security guards had a new respect for Officer Thompson's handling of the situation. Dr. Walsh was already drafting a memo to the board, knowing she would face questions, but feeling confident in her decision. And in room 314, Sarah slept peacefully, guarded by 4 angels on motorcycles who had promised to keep her safe. The world outside was still dangerous. Her father was still a threat, but for this moment, in this place, Sarah was protected. The question that lingered in the air, unspoken but palpable, was what would happen when David Martinez learned about the bikers. Would their presence deter him, or would it provoke him into something desperate? The answer was coming sooner than anyone expected. We've covered a lot of ground already, and the story is just beginning to unfold. What do you think so far? Are you surprised by how the hospital staff and patients reacted to the Iron Brotherhood? Have you ever witnessed a moment where your first impression of someone turned out to be completely wrong? Share your thoughts in the comments. We're curious to hear your perspective. And stay with us, because what happens next will take this story in a direction no one saw coming. The autumn rain that had been threatening since sunset finally arrived around midnight, drumming against the windows of Memorial Children's Hospital with steady persistence. Portland was accustomed to rain, the way some cities are accustomed to snow or heat, and the sound was almost comforting in its familiarity. In the hallway outside room 314, Jake "Hammer" Morrison sat in a chair that was far too small for his large frame, his leather vest draped over the back. Beside him, Maria "Blade" Rodriguez scrolled through her phone, checking messages from other Baca chapters across the country. Tommy "Wrench" Patterson stood near the window at the end of the corridor, watching the rain-slicked parking lot with the focused attention of someone expecting trouble. Silent Jim, true to his nickname, simply stood with his arms crossed, a human wall of deterrence. The night shift nurses had gradually warmed to their presence. Nurse Jennifer Chen had brought them coffee around 10 o'clock, and by 11:30, several staff members were asking questions about the Iron Brotherhood and Baca. The transformation from fear to acceptance had happened faster than Hammer had expected, but he had learned that people were generally good once they got past their initial prejudices. Inside room 314, Sarah had woken from her medicated sleep around 11. The chemotherapy made her nauseated, and Rebecca held a basin while her daughter's small body was racked with dry heaves. There was nothing left in Sarah's stomach to expel, but the medication didn't care. It was brutal, methodical, and necessary. When the episode passed, Sarah asked about the people in the hallway. Rebecca explained as best she could, trying to make sense of something that seemed surreal even to her. Bikers, motorcycles, protection. The words felt strange in combination, like a story someone else was telling. Sarah wanted to meet them. Despite her exhaustion, despite the nausea, despite everything, she wanted to see the angels on motorcycles her mother had mentioned. Rebecca hesitated, concerned about exposing Sarah to more stimulation when she needed rest, but something in her daughter's eyes convinced her. Hammer entered the room with the careful movements of someone aware of his own size and the fragility of his surroundings. He had been in many children's hospital rooms over the years, and he never got used to it. The beeping machines, the sterile smell, the small bodies fighting battles no child should have to face. It hollowed him out every time, but he smiled when he saw Sarah, and it was genuine. Her thin face and patchy hair didn't diminish her spirit, which seemed to shine through despite everything her body was enduring. She reminded him of his own granddaughter, who had battled and beaten childhood leukemia 5 years earlier. That experience had been what drove him to Baca in the first place. Sarah studied Hammer with the intense focus that children possess, seeing things adults often miss. She pointed to a tattoo on his forearm, a detailed rendering of a phoenix rising from flames. Hammer sat carefully on the edge of a chair beside her bed, the furniture creaking under his weight. He looked at the tattoo, then at Sarah, and his voice carried the weight of lived experience. Sarah absorbed this, her young mind processing complexities that most 7-year-olds never had to consider. Then she held up her worn rabbit, introducing him with the formality of a diplomat. Hammer reached out and gently shook one of Mr. Hoppy's ears, treating the gesture with appropriate seriousness. In that moment, Rebecca saw something she hadn't seen in her daughter for months. Joy. Not just a smile, not just momentary distraction, but genuine joy that reached her eyes and made her look like the child she had been before leukemia and fear and violence had stolen her innocence. Blade appeared in the doorway, having heard the conversation from the hall. She entered with a large bag slung over her shoulder, and when she opened it, Sarah's eyes widened. Inside were stuffed animals of every variety: bears, dogs, cats, even a small dragon. Blade explained that Baca members collected them for the children they protected, a small comfort in situations that offered little comfort. Sarah carefully selected a small tiger with bright orange fur and fierce black stripes. She held it up next to Mr. Hoppy, explaining to her rabbit that he now had a friend, and friends made everything less scary. Rebecca excused herself briefly, stepping into the bathroom to cry without her daughter seeing. The emotions were overwhelming: gratitude, relief, and a grief for all the time they had lost to fear. When she emerged, her eyes were red, but her smile was genuine. The next several hours established a rhythm. The bikers changed shifts every 4 hours, each group bringing its own personality, but the same unwavering commitment. Wrench brought Sarah a small music box that played a gentle melody. Silent Jim, despite his name, read to her from a children's book he pulled from his vest, his deep voice transforming the simple story into something magical. Pops taught her a simple card trick, his weathered hands moving with surprising dexterity. But the true revelation came around 3 in the morning, when the newest shift arrived. Among them was a man named Carlos "Doc" Rodriguez, a former army medic who had served 3 tours in Iraq before joining the Iron Brotherhood. Doc had extensive medical training, and when he learned about Sarah's condition, he spent time talking with Rebecca about treatment options, side effects, and what to expect in the coming weeks. Doc's knowledge was comprehensive and specific, delivered without condescension or false hope. He explained that his own son had died of leukemia 7 years earlier, and he had devoted himself to learning everything he could about childhood cancer. It was too late to help his own boy, but he could help others. Rebecca found herself asking questions she had been too afraid or overwhelmed to ask the doctors. Doc answered each one with patience and honesty, filling in gaps in her understanding and helping her feel less helpless. Knowledge, he explained, was a form of power, and power was what you needed when fighting an enemy like cancer. As dawn approached, the rain tapered off, leaving the city glistening and clean. The shift changed again, and Hammer returned for his second rotation. He had gone home for a few hours of sleep, showered, and returned with fresh coffee and a determination that showed no signs of fatigue. Dr. Walsh made her rounds early, arriving at 6:30 to check on how the arrangement was working. She found the floor quieter and more organized than she had expected. The bikers weren't disruptive. If anything, their presence had created an atmosphere of security that seemed to benefit everyone. She spoke with several nurses who reported that other patients' families had noticed the bikers and asked questions. Word was spreading through the hospital about Sarah and her protectors, and the story was generating unexpected reactions. Some families facing similar situations with abusive ex-partners had inquired whether Bakker could help them too. Dr. Walsh saw an opportunity. She asked Hammer if he would be willing to speak with hospital social workers about expanding Bakker's relationship with Memorial. There were other children who could benefit from this protection, other families living in fear. Hammer agreed immediately, explaining that this was exactly what Bakker existed to do. By mid-morning, Sarah was awake and asking about her protectors. The chemotherapy had left her weak, but her spirits were remarkably improved. She asked her mother if she could give the bikers something, a way to say thank you. Rebecca suggested they draw pictures, and Sarah agreed enthusiastically. For the next hour, Sarah worked on a drawing with fierce concentration. Her motor skills were compromised by the medication, making the lines shaky and imprecise, but the image was clear. A little girl standing in the middle of a circle of people on motorcycles, all of them holding hands. Above the scene, she had drawn a sun with a smiling face, and at the bottom, in careful letters, she had written, "My Annuals." When she presented the drawing to Hammer, the large man's eyes filled with tears he didn't bother to hide. He held the paper as if it were made of glass, studying every detail, and his voice cracked when he thanked her. Hammer promised, and Sarah believed him. Children have a remarkable ability to sense truth, and everything about Hammer told her he was a man who kept his promises. The drawing was photographed and shared within the Iron Brotherhood, spreading through their network with the speed of significance. Other chapters commented, offering support and asking for updates. The Portland chapter had undertaken dozens of cases over the years, but something about Sarah's situation resonated differently. Perhaps it was the combination of cancer and abuse, 2 battles no child should face simultaneously. Perhaps it was Sarah's spirit, which refused to be crushed despite everything working against her. Or perhaps it was simply that this was the moment when the right people were in the right place at the right time, and something transformative could happen. As lunchtime approached, Rebecca's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and her face went pale. It was a text from David. "I know about the bikers. You think they scare me. I'm still her father. This isn't over." Rebecca showed the message to Hammer, her hand shaking. Hammer read it twice, his expression hardening. This was the escalation they had been expecting. David Martinez wasn't going to be deterred by their presence. If anything, it had provoked him. Hammer immediately contacted the rest of the leadership. They needed to increase their visibility, make it clear that David would face more than just 4 bikers if he tried anything. Within an hour, 12 members of the Iron Brotherhood arrived at the hospital, parking their motorcycles in a prominent row near the main entrance. Officer Marcus Thompson was notified and arrived to coordinate with hospital security. The Portland police were briefed, with special attention given to David Martinez's description, vehicle, and known hangouts. A detective specializing in domestic violence cases, Laura Morrison, no relation to Hammer, stopped by to speak with Rebecca about strengthening the restraining order and potentially pressing additional charges based on David's threatening messages. The hospital was now on high alert, but not in the panic panicked way of the previous night. This was organized, professional, and supported by law enforcement. Dr. Walsh held a brief meeting with department heads, explaining the situation and ensuring everyone understood the protocols. Throughout all of this, Sarah remained in her room, unaware of the storm gathering around her. She played with her new tiger, had Mr. Hoppy perform a puppet show, and asked Blade to teach her how to braid hair. The normalcy of childhood persisted even in the most abnormal circumstances, a testament to the resilience of young minds. By afternoon, the story had reached local media. A reporter from the Oregonian called Dr. Walsh, asking for comment about the biker gang at the children's hospital. Dr. Walsh carefully corrected the terminology. They were a motorcycle club, not a gang, and they were there on a protective mission, but she declined to provide details about Sarah's case to protect the family's privacy. The reporter persisted, and by evening, a news van was parked outside the hospital. The story was too compelling to ignore. Tough bikers protecting a sick child from her abusive father. It had all the elements of something that would resonate with readers and viewers. Hammer discussed the media attention with Rebecca, giving her complete control over the decision. She was hesitant at first, worried about exposing Sarah to more stress, but Detective Morrison pointed out that publicity might actually protect them. If David's threats and the protective response became public knowledge, he would be less likely to act. Abusers thrived in shadows. Light was often the best deterrent. Rebecca agreed to a brief statement, and that evening, the local news ran a carefully worded story about bikers against child abuse, protecting a young patient at Memorial Children's Hospital. They didn't use Sarah's name or show her face, but they interviewed Hammer, who explained Baker's mission with the same straightforward honesty he brought to everything. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The hospital's phone lines lit up with calls of support. Donations began flowing in, both to Baker and to a fund that was quickly established for Sarah's medical expenses. People wanted to help, wanted to be part of something good, wanted to stand against the kind of violence that threatened vulnerable children. But not all responses were positive. David Martinez saw the news segment in a bar on the east side of Portland, and according to witnesses, he flew into a rage. He threw a glass at the television, screamed obscenities, and stormed out, threatening to show them who her real father is. The bar owner called the police, but by the time officers arrived, David was gone. Detective Morrison received the report at 8:15 that evening. She immediately contacted Hammer and hospital security. The situation had escalated exactly as they had feared. David felt humiliated, challenged, and backed into a corner. In domestic violence cases, that combination was extremely dangerous. The Iron Brotherhood increased their presence to 8 members in the hospital at all times, with another dozen on standby in the parking lot. They weren't just protecting Sarah anymore. They were preparing for a confrontation. Rebecca sensed the change in atmosphere. The bikers were more focused, their casual conversations replaced by tactical discussions. Officer Thompson was now stationed permanently outside Sarah's room, his military bearing obvious. Even the nurses moved with more urgency, as if bracing for a storm. Sarah, blessedly, remained insulated from most of this. She was having a good day by her standards. The nausea had subsided, and she had enough energy to sit up and color. Blade spent the afternoon with her, and they created an elaborate story about the tiger and Mr. Hoppy going on adventures to magical lands where no one was ever sick or scared. As night fell on the hospital, the tension was palpable. Everyone was waiting for something to happen, for David to make his move. The question wasn't if, but when. The security footage would later show David Martinez's truck entering the parking lot at 9:47 that evening. He parked in a distant corner, beyond the range of most cameras, and sat there for 17 minutes before getting out. He was drunk. Subsequent blood tests would confirm a blood alcohol level nearly 3 times the legal limit, and he moved with the careful deliberation of someone trying to hide their intoxication. He avoided the main entrance, where the row of motorcycles made it clear the bikers were present in force. Instead, he headed for a side entrance used primarily by staff. He had been to the hospital enough times during Sarah's treatment to know the building's layout. A nurse entering for her shift noticed him and immediately recognized him from the photos distributed by security. She didn't confront him. She went inside and raised the alarm. Within seconds, the hospital's communication system crackled to life, with code words that meant one thing: the threat had arrived. Officer Thompson and 4 bikers bikers, hammer, wrench, blade, and a massive man named Bear, who stood 6'7" and weighed 300 pounds of solid muscle, positioned themselves in the corridor outside Sarah's room. The door was locked from the inside, with Rebecca and Sarah secure. Two more bikers guarded the stairwell exit, and another pair watched the elevators. David Martinez made it to the third floor, using a service stairwell. He emerged into a corridor one section over from Sarah's room, and he immediately knew he had made a mistake. Between him and his daughter stood a human wall of leather and determination. The confrontation that followed would be recounted in dozens of ways over the coming weeks, but the security footage provided an objective record. David Martinez, swaying slightly, pointed at Hammer and demanded to see his daughter. His words were slurred, his gestures aggressive, but he stopped when he saw the sheer number of people standing against him. Hammer stepped forward, his voice calm but carrying an edge that suggested very bad things would happen if David took another step. The distance between them was perhaps 15 feet, and every inch of it was charged with potential violence. David's rage fought against his survival instincts. He wanted to push through, wanted to prove that no one could keep him from his daughter, but even in his intoxicated state, he could see that any attempt would end badly for him. These weren't security guards he could intimidate or hospital staff he could bully. These were men and women who had seen violence, who had survived it, and who would not back down. The Portland police arrived within 4 minutes, responding to the hospital's emergency call. 3 officers entered the corridor, assessing the situation quickly. David Martinez was violating a restraining order, trespassing, and creating a disturbance. They moved to arrest him, and for a moment it seemed like he might resist, but Hammer spoke again, and this time his words carried a different weight. Something in David's face crumbled. He looked past the bikers, past the police, toward the door where his daughter was hidden, and for just a moment the rage fell away, revealing something that might have been regret or grief, or the realization of everything he had destroyed through his own choices. The officers handcuffed David Martinez and led him away. He went without resistance, his head down, his bravado completely deflated. The corridor remained silent for a long moment after he was gone, everyone processing what had just happened. Then Sarah's voice came through the door, small and frightened. Rebecca opened the door, and Sarah stood there in her hospital gown, clutching Mr. Hoppy and her tiger, tears streaming down her face. Hammer knelt down so they were at eye level, and his voice was the gentlest thing anyone had ever heard from such a hard-looking man. Sarah threw her arms around Hammer's neck, and he held her carefully, as if she were made of porcelain. Rebecca joined them, her arms around both her daughter and this stranger who had become their protector. Blade wrapped her arms around all 3 of them, and then Wrench and Bear, until it was a tangle of leather and tears and relief. The crisis had passed. David Martinez would be held overnight, would face charges for violating the restraining order, and would eventually be sentenced to 6 months in jail with mandatory anger management and substance abuse treatment. The immediate threat was over, but the impact of what had happened would resonate far beyond that single night. We want to pause here and thank you for staying with us through this journey. What you've witnessed is more than just a story. It's a testament to the power of community, the importance of standing up for the vulnerable, and the way human beings can surprise us when we look past our assumptions. The Iron Brotherhood didn't just protect Sarah that night. They changed the way an entire community thought about who heroes could be. We're not done yet. The best is still to come. Stay with us as we continue this remarkable story. The morning after David Martinez's arrest brought an unexpected calm to Memorial Children's Hospital. The rain had stopped during the night, and Portland awakened to one of those rare autumn days when the sun broke through the clouds and everything seemed washed clean and new. In room 314, Sarah slept deeply for the first time in weeks. The trauma of the previous night had exhausted her, but there was something different about her sleep now. Her small body was relaxed, her breathing steady, and the lines of tension that had become permanent fixtures on her young face had softened. Rebecca sat in her familiar chair, but she looked different too. The dark circles under her eyes were still there, the weight loss still obvious, but something fundamental had shifted. She no longer carried her fear alone, and that made all the difference. The Iron Brotherhood had maintained their vigil through the night, but with David in custody, the immediate crisis had passed. Hammer sat in the hallway, finally allowing himself to feel the exhaustion he had been pushing aside for nearly 24 hours. His back ached from the uncomfortable hospital chairs, and his eyes burned with fatigue, but he felt something he rarely allowed himself: satisfaction. Dr. Walsh arrived at 7:30 for her morning rounds, and she brought news. The story had exploded overnight. The video footage of David Martinez's confrontation with the bikers, carefully edited to protect Sarah's privacy, had been shared thousands of times on social media. Major news outlets were picking up the story. Good Morning America wanted to do a segment. The hospital's phone lines were overwhelmed with calls from journalists, supporters, and other families asking if Baca could help them. More importantly, the donations to Sarah's medical fund had topped $50,000 overnight. People from across the country were contributing, moved by a story that seemed to crystallize something essential about protecting the innocent. The fund would cover Sarah's treatment costs and give Rebecca enough financial breathing room to focus entirely on her daughter's recovery. But the media attention brought complications. A lawyer representing David Martinez called Dr. Walsh, threatening to sue the hospital, Baca, and everyone involved for defamation and violating his parental rights. Detective Morrison assured them the threats were baseless. David had violated a restraining order while intoxicated and had no legal standing, but the lawyer's involvement suggested David's family was rallying to his defense. Hammer received a call from the National Baca Organization. The president, a former Marine named Jack Spike Wilson, congratulated him on handling the situation, but warned about the increased scrutiny. Every action they took would now be examined, criticized, and potentially misrepresented. They needed to be careful, professional, and above reproach. The Iron Brotherhood understood. They had been living under scrutiny their entire adult lives, judged for their appearance, their lifestyle, their choices. This was just another version of the same battle. They would do what they always did: prove through actions what words couldn't accomplish. Over the next several days, a new rhythm established itself. The bikers reduced their presence to a sustainable level. 2 members in the hospital at all times, rotating through 4-hour shifts. They coordinated closely with hospital security, which had come to respect and appreciate their professionalism. Sarah's treatment continued its brutal course. Some days she was strong enough to sit up and play. Other days, the chemotherapy left her so weak she could barely lift her head. The bikers were there for all of it, a constant presence that provided comfort even in the darkest moments. Wrench brought his guitar one afternoon and played soft melodies outside her room. The hospital usually discouraged such things, but Dr. Walsh made an exception. The music seemed to soothe not just Sarah, but other children on the floor, and soon parents were requesting that he play during visiting hours. Blade organized a teddy bear drive, collecting hundreds of stuffed animals that were distributed to children throughout the hospital. What started as a gesture for Sarah expanded into something that benefited everyone. The hospital's child life specialists were amazed at the impact. Children who had been withdrawn and scared suddenly had comfort objects and stories about the motorcycle angels who protected them. Pops started a weekly magic show in the hospital's recreational room. Children in wheelchairs, trailing IV poles, some bald from chemotherapy like Sarah, gathered to watch this weathered biker pull coins from ears and make cards disappear. The laughter was medicine that came in no prescription bottle. Silent Jim, despite his nickname, began reading to children during his shifts. His deep, gravelly voice transformed picture books into epic adventures. Parents would linger in doorways, listening to this intimidating-looking man narrate tales of courage and friendship with unexpected tenderness. The hospital staff, initially wary, became allies and friends. Nurses saved extra coffee for the bikers. Security guards shared war stories with the veterans in the group. Even the hospital administrator, Dr. Walsh, found herself looking forward to her conversations with Hammer, who possessed a wisdom that came from hard living and harder lessons learned. But while life inside the hospital found its rhythm, trouble was brewing outside. David Martinez, released on bail after 3 days in jail, was not accepting his situation quietly. His lawyer was pursuing an aggressive legal strategy, arguing that David had been provoked by the bikers' presence and that his parental rights were being violated. More concerning, David had begun drinking heavily and making increasingly disturbing statements to anyone who would listen. Bar owners reported that he talked obsessively about his daughter, about the bikers who had stolen her from him, and about making things right. The restraining order prohibited him from going near Memorial Children's Hospital or contacting Rebecca, but paper couldn't control a man spiraling into obsessive rage. Detective Morrison visited the hospital weekly to update Rebecca and coordinate with the Iron Brotherhood. She had seen this pattern before in domestic violence cases. The abuser, denied access to his victim, becomes fixated and dangerous. David wasn't done. He was just planning his next move. The move came on a Tuesday afternoon in mid-October, 3 weeks after the bikers had first arrived at the hospital. Sarah was having a good day, well enough to take a short walk around the floor with her mother and Blade. The three of them made a slow circuit, Sarah pushing her IV pole with determination, stopping every few steps to rest but refusing to give up. They were in the recreational room, watching Pops set up for his magic show, when hospital security received an alert. A man matching David Martinez's description had been spotted in the parking lot, sitting in his truck, watching the entrance. He had been there for over an hour. Officer Thompson, who had essentially been assigned permanently to Sarah's protection detail, immediately went to investigate. He found David exactly where reported, parked in a far corner with a clear view of the main entrance. When Thompson approached, David started his truck and left, but not before Thompson got a clear look at his face. It was David, and the expression Thompson saw was concerning, not rage, but cold calculation. Thompson reported back to Detective Morrison, who obtained security footage from the parking lot cameras. Analysis showed that David had been conducting surveillance, noting patterns of when shifts changed, when the parking lot was most crowded, when attention would be most divided. He was planning something. The Iron Brotherhood increased their presence again, and Detective Morrison assigned additional police patrols to the area. But Portland had limited resources, and they couldn't maintain intensive protection indefinitely. Something had to give. The answer came from an unexpected source. One of the Iron Brotherhood members, a former Army Ranger named Marcus "Ghost" Patterson, had connections in the veteran community. He reached out to a network of former military personnel who lived in the Portland area and explained the situation. Within 24 hours, the Iron Brotherhood had reinforcements. 30 veterans, ranging from Vietnam-era soldiers to recent Iraq and Afghanistan combat veterans, volunteered to help maintain the protective watch. These weren't bikers, and they didn't wear leather vests, but they understood the mission: protect the innocent, stand against threats, never abandon a brother or sister in need. The distinction between military service and what Barker did wasn't as large as civilians might think. The expanded protection detail was organized with military precision. Ghost created a schedule, established communication protocols, and set up a command center in an unused conference room that Dr. Walsh made available. The hospital, initially concerned about having so many unofficial security personnel on site, quickly recognized the professionalism and organization these veterans brought. David Martinez, watching from a distance, saw his opportunity slipping away. The protection around Sarah was too tight, too organized, too determined. His legal options were failing. The judge had denied his motion to modify the restraining order and had actually extended it based on his surveillance behavior. His family, initially supportive, was beginning to distance themselves as they realized the extent of his obsession. Desperate men do desperate things. On a Friday evening in late October, 4 weeks after the bikers first arrived, David Martinez made his final move. He didn't go to the hospital. Instead, he went to Rebecca's apartment, the one she hadn't visited in weeks because she was living at the hospital with Sarah. He broke in through a window, and once inside, he called Rebecca's phone. When she answered, recognizing the number and answering out of habit before she could stop herself, David's voice was calm in a way that terrified her more than his rage ever had. Rebecca's blood turned to ice. She was at the hospital, surrounded by protection, but her apartment was 15 minutes away. She had photographs there, Sarah's belongings from before the diagnosis, irreplaceable memories. And David knew exactly how to hurt her, not by attacking her directly, but by destroying everything she had left from the life before cancer and fear. She hung up and immediately told Hammer, who was on shift. His response was immediate and decisive. He called Ghost, who activated a team of 5 veterans living closest to Rebecca's address. Then he called the Portland police, explaining the situation and the address. The race was on. Could they reach the apartment before David did something irreversible? The veterans arrived first, pulling up to the modest apartment building in 3 vehicles. They didn't charge in. Ghost had trained them better than that. They surrounded the building, establishing a perimeter, and waited for police backup. Inside, David Martinez was living out his fantasy of control. He couldn't control his divorce, couldn't control his daughter's illness, couldn't control the legal system that had turned against him, but he could control this moment. He systematically destroyed everything in the apartment: Sarah's toys, family photographs, furniture. He poured gasoline. He had brought 2 containers with him over Rebecca's belongings, preparing to set fire to everything. Portland police arrived within 7 minutes of the call. Detective Morrison was among them, having been notified immediately. She established command, coordinated with the veterans surrounding the building, and attempted to make contact with David through the apartment door. What followed was a 40-minute standoff. David, surrounded and trapped, held a lighter over the gasoline-soaked apartment, threatening to ignite everything. The police evacuated the building and called in their hostage negotiation team, even though there were no hostages in the traditional sense. The negotiator, a patient woman named Sarah Jennings, the coincidence of the name was not lost on anyone, spoke with David through the door. She let him talk, let him vent his grievances, let him explain his side of a story that made sense only in his alcohol and rage-twisted mind. Back at the hospital, Rebecca sat in Sarah's room, holding her daughter and trying not to fall apart. Sarah, sensing her mother's distress but not understanding its source, asked if the angels on motorcycles could fix whatever was wrong. Rebecca, tears streaming down her face, said she hoped so. Hammer stood in the hallway, his phone pressed to his ear, receiving updates from Ghost at the scene. The situation was contained but volatile. If David lit that fire, it would spread through the old apartment building within minutes. There were families in the surrounding units, including children. A fire wouldn't just destroy Rebecca's belongings, it could kill innocent people. The breakthrough came from an unexpected angle. One of the veterans at the scene, a former Marine named Wilson, recognized David's name. They had served together briefly years ago. Wilson asked Detective Morrison if he could try talking to David, approaching him not as an enemy, but as a brother veteran who understood the darkness that could swallow a man whole. Morrison hesitated. This was highly irregular, but she was running out of options. She allowed Wilson to approach the door, accompanied by the negotiator. Wilson's voice carried the weight of shared experience. He talked about his own struggles after leaving the service, about the rage he had felt, about the times he had stood on the edge of doing something that couldn't be undone. He talked about getting help, about learning to live with demons that never entirely went away but could be managed. David listened. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, someone was talking to him without judgment, without anger, without seeing him as only a monster. Wilson didn't excuse David's actions, but he recognized the human being underneath the terrible choices. The conversation lasted 20 minutes. Finally, David set down the lighter. He opened the door, his hands visible and empty, and allowed himself to be arrested. The gasoline was cleaned up, the apartment secured, and a catastrophe was averted. When Rebecca received the call that it was over, that David was in custody and the fire had been prevented, she collapsed into Hammer's arms, sobbing with relief and grief and exhaustion. Sarah, frightened by her mother's emotional breakdown, began crying too, and Blades swept in to comfort her, distracting her with stories and promises that everything would be okay. David Martinez was charged with attempted arson, breaking and entering, violating a restraining order, and criminal mischief. The judge, reviewing his pattern of escalating behavior, denied bail. David would remain in custody pending trial, and given the severity of the charges, he was looking at significant prison time. The immediate crisis was finally, truly over. But the story was far from finished, because something remarkable had emerged from this nightmare. The cooperation between Baca, the veteran community, law enforcement, and the hospital had created a model for protecting vulnerable families that had never existed before. And the little girl at the center of it all was still fighting her own battle against leukemia, a battle that would determine whether all this protection had been enough. Winter came early to Portland that year. By mid-November, frost painted delicate patterns on hospital windows, and the city bundled itself against cold winds that swept down from the mountains. Inside Memorial Children's Hospital, though, something warmer than any season was taking root. Sarah Martinez's battle with leukemia continued through the holidays with the relentless intensity that characterized her treatment protocol. There were good days and terrible days, moments of hope and moments of despair. Her small body endured rounds of chemotherapy that would challenge adults, radiation treatments that left her exhausted for days, and countless procedures that tested the limits of her courage. But she was never alone. The Iron Brotherhood had become a permanent presence at Memorial, expanding their mission beyond Sarah's protection to creating a comprehensive support network for families facing similar struggles. What began as one chapter protecting one child had evolved into something that would change the hospital's entire approach to patient care. Hammer, who had initially planned to step back once David was in custody, found himself drawn deeper into the work. He coordinated with hospital social workers to identify families dealing with domestic violence, abuse, or threats. The protection model developed for Sarah was adapted and applied to 7 other families by December. The Iron Brotherhood and their veteran allies became an unofficial but essential part of Memorial's security infrastructure. The hospital administration, initially concerned about liability and unconventional approaches, commissioned an independent study to evaluate the program's impact. The results were striking. Patient satisfaction scores in families with BACA protection were significantly higher. Children felt safer, which improved their cooperation with treatment. Parents experiencing protection were better able to focus on their children's medical needs rather than being paralyzed by fear. Even staff morale improved, as nurses and doctors found it easier to do their jobs when families felt secure. Dr. Patricia Walsh presented the findings to Memorial's Board of Directors in January, proposing a formal partnership with Bikers Against Child Abuse and the veteran volunteer organization that had evolved from Ghost's initial outreach. The board, after lengthy deliberation, approved a pilot program with funding for liability insurance, background check verification, and coordination resources. It was unprecedented. A major hospital system was officially partnering with a motorcycle club. The decision made national news, with reactions ranging from enthusiastic support to skeptical criticism. But Dr. Walsh stood firm, pointing to the measurable improvements in patient outcomes and family welfare. For Sarah, the progress was both medical and emotional. By February, her treatment had progressed to a point where her oncologist was cautiously optimistic. The cancer was responding to therapy. Her blood counts were improving. The possibility of remission, which had seemed desperately distant months earlier, was becoming realistic. But the toll had been enormous. Sarah had missed an entire school year. She'd lost all her hair, gained and lost weight dramatically, and endured pain that no 7-year-old should know exists. Her childhood had been stolen by leukemia and her father's violence, replaced by hospital rooms and fear. The Iron Brotherhood tried to give some of that childhood back. They organized small celebrations for every milestone, completing a treatment cycle, a day without nausea, a blood test showing improvement. Birthdays became elaborate affairs, with bikers bringing cakes and presents and filling Sarah's room with laughter. Wrench created a custom leather vest in Sarah's size, tiny compared to the massive vests worn by the bikers, but crafted with the same care. It bore a special patch. Honorary Iron Brotherhood member, Little Fighter, Nashio. When they presented it to her in March, Sarah wore it over her hospital gown, with pride that made every hardened biker in the room struggle to control their emotions. Rebecca, meanwhile, was undergoing her own transformation. The financial support from donations meant she could quit her waitressing job and focus entirely on Sarah. But more than that, the community of support around her had shown her that she didn't have to carry every burden alone. She began attending a support group for parents of children with cancer, facilitated by a hospital counselor. She learned to accept help without feeling weak, to ask for what she needed without shame. She also began processing the trauma of her relationship with David. With the immediate threat removed, the psychological wounds had space to surface and heal. She worked with a therapist who specialized in domestic violence survivors, slowly untangling the patterns of abuse that had seemed normal until she saw them from outside. David Martinez remained in jail, awaiting trial on multiple charges. His lawyer had negotiated a plea deal, 7 years in prison, in exchange for pleading guilty to all charges and agreeing to surrender all parental rights to Sarah. Rebecca agonized over the decision. Despite everything, David was Sarah's father, and Sarah was young enough that she might not remember the violence clearly. But Hammer, who had become a trusted advisor and friend, helped Rebecca understand a difficult truth. Sarah needed safety and stability more than she needed a relationship with a father who had proven himself dangerous. Love, no matter how genuine, couldn't overcome patterns of violence that David refused to address. Accepting the plea deal meant Sarah could grow up without fear, without waiting for the next eruption of of rage. Rebecca signed the paperwork in April, officially terminating David's parental rights. It felt like another death, the end of whatever dreams she had once held about their family, but it also felt like freedom, like finally being able to breathe after years of holding her breath, waiting for disaster. The trial's conclusion made news, closing the circle on a story that had captivated the Portland community. But for Sarah and Rebecca, it was just one more step in a longer journey. Spring brought literal new growth to Portland and metaphorical new growth to Sarah. In May, 5 months after the Iron Brotherhood first arrived at the hospital, Sarah's oncologist delivered news that Rebecca had almost been afraid to hope for. Sarah was in remission. The cancer, which had threatened to steal everything, had retreated under the assault of treatment and Sarah's extraordinary resilience. The celebration that followed was massive. The Iron Brotherhood organized a remission party in the hospital's recreational room, inviting every family they had worked with, the hospital staff who had supported them, the veteran volunteers, and the police and detectives who had helped keep everyone safe. It wasn't just Sarah's victory, it was a shared triumph over darkness by an improbable community that had formed in response to crisis. Sarah, wearing her small leather vest and still bald but radiating health that had been absent for months, stood in front of the assembled crowd and spoke with the clarity that sometimes comes to children who have faced death and decided to choose life instead. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. Hammer, this tough man who had seen combat and bar fights and the worst humanity had to offer, wept openly as he lifted Sarah onto his shoulders so she could see over the crowd. She was his angel, he told anyone who would listen, and she had saved him as much as he had saved her. In June, Sarah was discharged from Memorial Children's Hospital. She would need ongoing monitoring, regular checkups, and years of follow-up care, but she could go home. Rebecca had found a new apartment, smaller but safer than the old one, in a neighborhood where neighbors looked out for each other. The Iron Brotherhood helped them move, carrying boxes and furniture, setting up Sarah's new bedroom with care and humor. The final act came in August, when the hospital held a press conference to announce the permanent establishment of the Child Protection Partnership Program, formally integrating bikers against child abuse and veteran volunteers into Memorial's patient services. Dr. Walsh, Hammer, Ghost, and Detective Morrison stood together, an unlikely coalition united by a shared commitment to protecting the vulnerable. The program would serve as a model for hospitals across the country. Within 2 years, 53 other medical centers would establish similar partnerships. The story of how 78 bikers crashed a hospital to save a girl would become a case study in breaking down prejudice, building community, and reimagining what protection could look like. But perhaps the most profound change happened in the hearts and minds of everyone involved. The parents who had initially feared the bikers learned to see past leather and tattoos to the humanity underneath. The bikers found purpose and redemption in protecting children who couldn't protect themselves. The hospital staff discovered that best practices sometimes came from the most unexpected sources. The veteran community found a new mission that honored their service. And law enforcement learned that sometimes the best partners in protecting citizens were the people they might have once viewed with suspicion. Sarah started 2nd grade in September, nearly a year behind her peers, but determined to catch up. She wore hats to cover her slowly growing hair and carried Mr. Hoppy and her tiger to school every day. She told anyone who asked that she had been saved by angels on motorcycles, and while some teachers smiled at what they assumed was a child's fantasy, those who knew the truth understood she was exactly right. On the first anniversary of the night 78 motorcycles had rolled into the hospital parking lot, the Iron Brotherhood organized a memorial ride. Hundreds of bikers from across the Pacific Northwest joined, riding through Portland in formation, stopping at Memorial Children's Hospital, where Sarah, Rebecca, and dozens of other families they had helped stood waiting. Sarah rang a bell that the hospital had installed in honor of children who finished cancer treatment, a tradition borrowed from other hospitals but made special by the community that had formed around it. Each ring represented survival, courage, and the power of unlikely heroes standing together. The sound echoed across the city, a declaration that darkness could be fought, that vulnerable people didn't have to face their battles alone, and that heroism came in forms that defied every expectation. Hammer stood beside Sarah as she rang the bell, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. She looked up at him, this small girl who had faced faced leukemia and violence and survived both, and smiled with wisdom beyond her years. Hammer nodded, emotion threatening to overwhelm him once again. And in that moment, as the bell's echo faded into the warm August evening, as families applauded and bikers wiped away tears, and a city witnessed the power of community over isolation, something essential was proven: that preconceptions could be shattered, that help came from unexpected places, and that the measure of a person had nothing to do with their appearance and everything to do with their willingness to stand up when standing up mattered most. Sarah would face challenges ahead. Childhood leukemia survivors needed years of monitoring. The psychological scars from her father's violence would require ongoing therapy. Growing up without a father would bring its own complications, but she would face all of it surrounded by a community that had proven they would never abandon her, never stop protecting her, never let her fight alone. Rebecca would rebuild her life, slowly and carefully, learning to trust again and to believe that not all men were like David. She would eventually return to school, training to become a social worker so she could help other families navigate the darkness she had survived. The Iron Brotherhood would remain in her life, not as protectors anymore, but as extended family, the people who had shown up when she needed them most. And the Iron Brotherhood themselves would continue their work, expanding to protect more children, to challenge more assumptions, to be angels on motorcycles for every child who needed them. They had learned that their intimidating presence, which society had taught them to hide or soften, could be a gift when wielded in service of the vulnerable. They had found purpose that transcended their own stories of pain and redemption. The story that began with fear and roaring motorcycles ended with love and a ringing bell. It was a story about transformation, of Sarah from victim to survivor, of Rebecca from helpless to empowered, of the Iron Brotherhood from outlaws to heroes, of a hospital from traditional to innovative, of a community from divided to united. But most of all, it was a story about the truth that every human being who has ever lived eventually learns, if they're paying attention, that you cannot judge people by their appearance, that heroism wears many faces, and that when the worst of humanity threatens the innocent, the best of humanity will rise to meet it, no matter what form that humanity takes. Sarah Martinez, 9 years old now, still cancer-free, still surrounded by angels on motorcycles, understands this better than most adults ever will. She learned it during the hardest year of her young life, watching her mother's tears turn to smiles, watching terrifying strangers become beloved protectors, watching assumptions crumble under the weight of lived truth. And when people ask her, as they often do, what she learned from everything she went through, her answer is always the same. It's a lesson the world desperately needs to hear, spoken by a child who paid dearly to learn it, but who survived to share it with anyone willing to listen. This story reminds us that heroism doesn't always come in the package we expect. Sometimes it arrives on 78 Harley Davidsons, wearing leather and tattoos, carrying hearts bigger than most of us can imagine. The Iron Brotherhood didn't just protect one little girl, they changed an entire community's understanding of what it means to stand up for the vulnerable. What do you think about this story? Have you ever misjudged someone based on their appearance? Have you ever been surprised by who showed up to help in your darkest moment? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective and your own stories of unexpected heroes. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss another incredible true story. We bring you real stories about real people who prove that humanity is capable of extraordinary things when we look past our prejudices and see each other clearly. And don't leave yet. The next video we've recommended will introduce you to another group of unlikely heroes whose actions will restore your faith in humanity. Click on it now and continue this journey with us. Thank you for watching, for listening, and for keeping an open mind about who heroes can be.